Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through my alternative 10 greatest jazz albums. Earlier on in the year I did what I thought were the 10 greatest jazz albums, and I picked all the usual subjects, you know, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, all what you'd expect, Charlie Parker, Louis Armstrong. I picked all the obvious ones. Albums that had really created a dent in 20th century culture. Of course, there's a ton of artists who are very important, very influential, that have made incredible albums that don't get discussed so much. Now, I have got this idea from those jazz experts at Open Studio. Remember the guys that did a reaction video to my Why Do Modern Jazz Musicians All Sound the Same? Do you remember that? And then I did a reaction video back, and then I said, you know, why don't you have a chat to me, and you know, we could have a proper conversation about this, and they never got back to me. Well, the bald one, he did his top 10 greatest albums. Of course, he couldn't pick the obvious ones, you know, that would be far too popularist. So he had to pick all these alternative jazz albums that, you know, no one had heard of, you know. I would never want to accuse them of elitism, but it's a bit elitist, isn't it? Anyway, let's move on. I sat down and thought, well, yeah, I can't see how you can do a top 10 without including Kind of Blue, which is one of the biggest selling jazz albums of all time. It brought modality into music, it brought the idea of a conceptual album into music, and it's absolutely groundbreaking with some of the greatest playing from the players on there. It's just a monumental album. But I wondered whether I could tell an alternative story of jazz by looking at some other artists that did play a great part or made incredible albums that have sort of been forgotten, and try and tell a different story which might just widen the sort of narrative of what jazz is for you. And if you are a jazz fan and you had all the albums on this list, there may be some albums on here you want to check out. So I'm going to kick off straight away with the first album. This isn't in ranking order, this is in a time order. This is like the earliest to the most recent, I think, although I might move it around a little bit when I get to the end. Right, so the first artist I want to talk about is Jelly Roll Morton, and I want to put forward the album Piano Rolls. This album was recorded in the early 1920s. It wasn't recorded onto disc, it wasn't cut with a needle, you know, it wasn't recorded with a microphone. Jelly Roll Morton sat down in the early 1920s and played on a piano roll piano, which cuts a piano roll. And that means that they can take that piano roll, put it into a modern machine and record it with modern technology. So we get to hear what Jelly Roll Morton sounded like in hi-fi in the 1920s. Now, Jelly Roll Morton's an interesting character because he was born in 1890 and he emerged onto the jazz scene in the early 1900s, the same time as Buddy Bolden. He's there right at the start, and he's one of the few musicians from that era that then gets to record in the early 1920s. So this gives us an idea of where jazz was coming from. Now, Jelly Roll Morton had come up as a sort of from a middle-class family, educated musician that had then gone and played piano in Storyville, in the brothels, right? And he'd learned his trade there. He'd seen people like Buddy Bolden. He's right at the beginning of it, and he actually pulls a number of elements together. He brings in the Spanish tinge, as he called it. He was a Creole. So he brings in ragtime, he brings in the blues, and a certain type of swing, which he said he used because he couldn't play at these blinding speeds of other pianists. I think he's a pretty virtuoso pianist when you listen to these piano rolls. So when you listen to these, you're hearing the beginnings of jazz from a guy that claimed to have invented jazz. Now, the fact that he did this upset the jazz world. I'm sure people like Sidney Bechet and King Oliver, you know, they're all walking around going, well, who the hell's this guy saying it? But there is an element of truth. Jelly Roll Morton plays a huge role at the beginning of jazz, and he predates King Oliver. He's a contemporary of Buddy Bolden. This is really, really important. And we get to hear a recording because, of course, as soon as jazz was recorded, because jazz had been around for 20, 30 years when they decided to record the original Dixieland Jazz Band. And when they recorded it, it changed. This was obviously a party music. It was music of the brothels. It was marching band music, you know. And that music, they could have played for hours and hours and just soloed and jammed and had a great big party. But as soon as you sit down to record a record, you have to start arranging it. And as I've said on this channel, Louis Armstrong is the great genius that starts to arrange jazz. You know, he starts to separate solos out and have introductions, and he has musicians drop out. But so does Jelly Roll Morton, and his group recordings of the 1920s are also really important. But when we hear this, we hear the beginnings of jazz in hi-fi. So this is really good for people out there that can't stick listening to some crackly old record. So that's what I've got as my first album on this list, is the Piano Rolls album by Jelly Roll Morton. Now there's a contemporary of Jelly Roll Morton. It's a little bit younger, 7 years younger, and that's Fletcher Henderson. And Fletcher Henderson is the genius that also brings arrangement into big band composition, right? Because what we have with Dixieland jazz, which is predominantly what Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, Cindy Bechet, Jelly Roll Morton, they're all playing Dixieland jazz, and that's a certain style, small group with a front line, clarinet, usually clarinet, cornet, and trombone. And then it starts to get orchestrated for big band. And jazz changes. In the 1930s, jazz becomes the biggest selling music form on the planet. Right? Now the DNA of that type of arrangement is with Duke Ellington and Fletcher Henderson. And in fact, Fletcher Henderson predates to even Duke Ellington. This is the great genius of big band jazz. Right? He emerges with the group in 1924. Which features a whole host of incredible players. I think we've got Coleman Hawkins in there, who's basically going to invent saxophone playing. We've got later on, what's his name? The trumpet player. Oh, I can't remember. Who else have we got? That Benny Carter's in there, and Benny Carter is Roy Eldridge. That's the trumpet player, and he again is a musician that takes Louis Armstrong's trumpet style and moves it forward. I'm going to get there in the end. We also get Benny Carter, who is there's Don Redman does arrangements, and then later on Benny Carter, but also Fletcher Henderson also does arrangements in the 1920s. And when the big bands in the 30s are formed, primarily Benny Goodman, which is one of the biggest selling artists in the world, a white band, he uses Fletcher Henderson as an arranger. So the album I've got here is, what is it called? There's so many different ones. I've picked one out, and it's called, I'm going to have to just open up a picture of it because I can't remember what this album's called. There's a whole host of them. This is called Timeless Historical Presents Fletcher Henderson, The Harmony and Vocal Iron Sessions, Volume 1, 1925 to 1926. So you get to hear that big band sound, and you can hear the DNA of the swing era. That's what Fletcher Henderson did. He is monumental in the history of jazz, and I think any top 10, he does deserve to be on there. But of course, his input was eclipsed by the stuff he influenced with the Artie Shaw and the Dorsey brothers and Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman, and so we don't put the focus on Fletcher Henderson, but really it's Duke Ellington and Fletcher Henderson. So that's what I've got number 2, right? At number 3, right, bebop in the 40s is the next big stage forward, and when bebop has done its thing, Miles Davis comes out with the birth of the cool, and we get this idea of cool jazz, which is a lot more orchestrated, it's a lot calmer, it's a lot more arranged, and there's a whole bunch of what become known as West Coast jazz artists that are very, very important in moving jazz on from bebop, and it tends to split into sort of West Coast cool jazz and East Coast hard bop. Now, a musician that was an absolute genius in that area was Lenny Tristano. Lenny Tristano was a classically trained pianist. He was blind. He was born partially blind, and then later on, through a series of illnesses, he ends up completely blind. And he starts recording in the late 1940s, and he's got a host of players that are very important jazz musicians. I would think Warren Marsh, Lee Konitz, and Billy Bauer on guitar, the other two saxophone players. There is an album he makes in 1949 called Cross Currents, and it's a brilliant example of this West Coast jazz sound, highly intelligent with some of the greatest players. But on this album, there are 2 free improvised jazz pieces. One's called Intuition, I think, and one's called Divergence, I think. I'm pulling that out the top of my head. And on here, we see the beginnings of free jazz. We see the very thing that is going to move jazz from bebop to that next stage of development. And this is my point about sort of the jazz elite. That moves on. There's a history of moving into free jazz, modal jazz, that goes into fusion and all that type of thing. But the Jazz Academy has tried to force the tuition of jazz to basically cover that sort of bebop, hard bop approach. The West Coast musicians were really experimenting. People like Brubeck was experimenting with time signatures. And on here, this is a groundbreaking album, right? Now, I have gone out of order slightly, and I've jumped ahead, you know, because I was reading across. So I've made a mistake here, but I'm going to carry on because I'm doing all right at the moment. So a few years before that, we had this album, right? And this is an incredibly important album in the history of jazz. And I've got an original copy, which is about 60 years old, of that, right? And that is Charlie Christian at Minton's. This is where bebop was born. So I should have really talked about it before I talked about Lenny Tristano, but you know, I don't know, I've done it now anyway. So this is a very important album. This is a French pressing of it. It's a 10-inch album, very, very rare. Charlie Christian is one of the great geniuses of jazz. He's one of the most important musicians in the history of jazz. And I'll tell you why. Because he's the first to really develop single line playing on the guitar. Django's done it before that, Eddie Lang's done it, and Lonnie Johnson have done it. But the sophistication of Charlie Christian's playing is incredible. He really is the father of jazz guitar. And he's also playing electric guitar, so he's like the father of electric guitar. But the other thing is, these experiments at Minton's he was doing with these players, which include like Kenny Clarke, we've got I think Thelonious Monk's on here, Don Byas, Roy Eldridge, you know, all these players that were going down to Minton's and basically inventing bebop, and we can hear it on these recordings. So this is a very, very important recording. I have done a whole video on Charlie Christian, and there may be a link there, maybe, I don't know if I can remember to do it. Right, so let's move on to the next album I've got. Now the next album is this is the most rarest album in my collection. Here we go. I am representing British jazz here, right, because I never do, and I thought, you know, we're now into this alternative and obscure, you know, jazz album, so why not put a British jazz album? And what we have here is this super rare vinyl album. This is probably the most rarest and expensive album in my collection. That's why it's in the plastic bag. Jazz Couriers in Concert, which features Ronnie Scott and Toby Hayes. It's also got Terry Shannon on piano, Phil Bates on bass, and Bill Eden on drums. This features Toby Hayes. Now, Britain has produced some incredible saxophone players. I'm thinking of Joe Harriott, and Joe Harriott nearly made my list, but I thought Toby Hayes was one of the first British jazz musicians that could compete and in a way go a little bit beyond some of the American players. And he did go to America and he played there and he was well received, but he didn't quite make it. And then of course Toby Hayes had heart problems in 1973 after an operation on his mitral valve, I think. I know this because I have a book that is up there. It's called The Long Shadow. I'll go and get it for you, come on. Right, I've got this book here and it's been sat in the background. Right. Oh, I can't get the thing out. Right. The Long Shadow of the Little Giant, the life, work and legacy of Toby Hayes. This nearly made my book list. Toby Hayes is an incredible player, and this is at the peak of his powers, live on stage with the Ronnie Scott group. So that's the next album I've got on the list to represent British jazz. And I need to come back here before, and I will talk a little bit about British jazz at the end of this video, I think. It's a little bit. Right, the next album I've got is, I believe, is one of the greatest jazz guitar albums and one of the greatest jazz albums of all time. And it's really, really obscure and it never gets mentioned, and I'll tell you why. It's the album which is called, it's called 3-4 the Blues. That's the version I've got it here as, but it also goes under the name, and I'm going to have to try and it's like something like New Winds, I can't remember. But the album I know is called 3-4 the Blues, right? And it's by Hank Garland, and it also features a very young Gary Burton. He's 17 years old on this, and I think it's who's on? Is it Richard Davis on bass? It's Joe Morello on drums. This is an incredible jazz guitar. Now Hank Garland came up through originally country music. He was a country guitarist, and he had this incredible picking technique. And he's really making some incredible country albums, and he gets picked up by the rock and rollers, and he records for Elvis Presley, he records for Roy Orbison, the Everly Brothers. He's coming out of rock and roll, And in 1960, he goes into the studio and makes this jazz album, and it's absolutely mind-blowing. It's one of the greatest jazz albums, greatest jazz guitar albums ever made. Then, after having an argument with his wife in 1961, and she sort of grabbed the kids and went off and said, "I'm leaving you," and he jumps in his car and he goes chasing them, and he drives into a tree, and he never really recovers from that accident. So this is the one only thing. There's a few live recordings as well, but this is the one and only well-recorded example of Hank Garland playing the guitar. And I'm going to have to tell you what the alternative title for this album is, because so I'm just going to jump here. As you know, when I make these videos, I try, and I don't like researching it too much. I try and pull from my knowledge, and you sometimes see me get unstuck, and that's part of the fun of my videos, I think. And sometimes, and I'm not actually too sure why this album's got two names, right? So I'm going to look that up now. Jazz Winds from a New Direction, right? That's the album, what that album is known as. But I say that I pulled out the copy that I grew up with. I no longer have that on vinyl. It's one of the ones that got lost, and I'm quite upset about that, because it is a really incredible album. So if you're a jazz guitar fan, go and check out Hank Garland. It is unbelievable. The line should go Charlie Christian, Tal Farlow, Hank Garland, Joe Pass, Wes Montgomery. That's the line of jazz guitarists, and he should be mentioned in there. Right, so what are we up to? Right, the next album I'm going to discuss is by an absolute jazz genius, and that is Andrew Hill. Andrew Hill started off originally as a classical pianist, and then when he learnt the blues, he took that and he started to make incredible post-bebop albums exploring free jazz. In 1964, he made an album called Point of Departure, which featured Kenny Dorham, Eric Dolphy, Joe Henderson, Richard Davis, and a very young Tony Williams, right? This album features Eric Dolphy's one of the last albums he's made, along with Out to Lunch. Now, we'd all agree that Out to Lunch could well be on one of the top 10 greatest lists of jazz albums. It didn't quite make mine, and I tell you why. Because I absolutely love Out to Lunch. It's a work of genius, but this one I like even more, and the stuff that Eric Dolphy and Andrew Hill is exploring on this album is mind-blowing. This is one of the greatest representations of free jazz, and if you're not comfortable with free jazz, check this album out, because it's so brilliantly played, right, that I'm sure it's avant-garde, but it's also accessible. I prefer it to Out to Lunch, to be honest. Eric Dolphy is incredible on here, and Kenny Dorham just burns on trumpet. Absolutely incredible album. It also features Richard Davis, Tony Williams. I've said all that, haven't I? So that's the album I've got. At sort of number 7 is Andrew Hill. This guy was a real genius and made some incredible albums, and I do not know why he hasn't gone down in history alongside Bill Evans and Thelonious Monk, you know, as one of the great pianists. Now, I'm now going to move to one of the most obscure albums on this list. This is unbelievably obscure, and it also has a genius jazz pianist on who is really never ever mentioned, and I'm going to grab it down here. I have it on CD, so where is it? Come on, where are you? Is it over here? Right, brilliant. I'm well organised, aren't I? You're impressed, aren't you? So this is an album by Eddie Gomez. If you go on Wikipedia and look up Eddie Gomez's discography, and Eddie Gomez's solo career is not that well known anyway. He's known more of a sideman. He emerged in 1966 in the B11's trio, sort of taking over from Scott LaFaro. He's a virtuoso bass player for Puerto Rico. He then does a lot of work with Chick Corea and a whole host of people, and that's what he's known for. His solo career is not that well known for. But this album isn't even listed on Wikipedia on his discography. It is so rare because it's on some cruddy little jazz label, which I think is called Pro Jazz. Yeah, that's the label. And it's this album, right? So I think I was in a camera shop once looking at camera stuff years ago, and I saw this in a box, and I thought, oh, it's Eddie Gomez, and I'll buy it. When I took it home, it absolutely blew me away. This is one of the greatest jazz trio albums ever made. On drums, we have Marcello Pillateri, his drumming's incredible. But on piano, we have Aidin Essen, one of the greatest jazz musicians, jazz improvisers, one of the greatest musicians of all time. So great that Rick Beato has done a video on him, right? And they've got some really obscure sort of camcorder footage of him playing. He could play classic jazz piano. He's also experimenting in electronics, and this is a great showcase, and it's beautifully recorded, and the compositions are incredible. It's really driving, it's exciting, the virtuosity is off the scale. This is a monumental album. They all share composition credits, so you get to hear Aidin Essen's compositions as well as the drummer's compositions. There's no Eddie Gomez compositions on here. It really is, it's an Aidin Essen album really, and it's the one you want to hear. This is a mind-blowing album. Look at it. Look at the cover. It's absolutely awful on Pro Jazz. So that's what I've got at number 8. So we're down to the last two. Right, so recently I did a video on no, I didn't do that. I did an interview with Jason Marsalis. I put myself off and I was thinking too far. I did a video with Jason Marsalis, and he came in agreeing with a lot of what I'd said about the contemporary jazz scene, but also arguing how the Marsalis brothers actually fit into this, and some of the accusations of conservatism that I'd aimed at them, you know, particularly Wynton Marsalis, have a context, there's a nuance there, and that Jason Marsalis interview I think is a much watch if you're interested in the history of jazz. The Black Codes album by Wynton Marsalis is a masterpiece, right? And I wanted to represent the Marsalis brothers after giving them a little bit of a criticism over the videos, and then, you know, Jason being so kind and to come on and do that. I believe this album I'm about to show you is one of the great jazz albums of all time. It should be on the top 10 list, and it's the Branford Marsalis Trio, and it's called The Dark Keys. It features Reginald Veal on bass and Jeff Tain Watts on drums. There's no piano on this, and this is an exploratory album. Branford is free to go anywhere. There's no harmony. There's harmony there, but the harmony's never pinned down. And that trio setting of just bass, sax and drums I absolutely love, and this is probably the best example of that ever. Branford Marsalis is one of the great jazz musicians of the last 40 years, and I'm going to do a video on the Marsalis brothers, particularly Branford, because I think he plays a counterpart to Wynton's conservatism. He's the guy playing with Sting, and he's out there, you know, making hip-hop albums, and I think he's an interesting character. So within that family, the dynamic is much richer than you think, as Jason pulled out. So I'm up to the last album now. So the album I decided to pull out, I thought when I do these, I don't like to bring in fusion albums or funky albums or any crossover albums. But I thought I wanted to put one album that represents free jazz, fusion, but also metal, and the very thing that jazz does that I absolutely love. So I pulled out the studio album by Last Exit. Now, I did a video recently when I talked about listening to difficult music, and I used the live Last Exit as an example, and it did horrify many people. This album is a work of genius, brilliantly produced by Bill Laswell, and it weaves all these different elements, the blues, funk, heavy metal, jazz, free jazz, Dixieland jazz. This represents, even though this is like over 30 years old now, this represents the spirit of jazz for me, and that's the last one I wanted to put on the list. For those of you who don't know, it features Bill Laswell on bass, Ronald Shannon Jackson on drums, Peter Brotzman on saxophone, and Sonny Sharrock on guitar. Everyone in this band now is dead except for Bill Laswell. Peter Brotzman died a few weeks ago, and it was an incredible band, and I felt I must represent them because I didn't want people to think I just used them as an example of just noise and avant-garde. That's an incredible album. So I've got to the end of the video now, right? I do want to mention a few more albums, right? So I've pulled a few out here that I'm just going to quickly go through. I think are absolutely fantastic. Expectations by Keith Jarrett, an absolute masterpiece of 70s jazz and 70s jazz fusion, but there's jazz on in here as well. I really like Keisha when he's not on ECM. There seems to be an unbridled freedom and earthiness, and that's what this album has. It's an incredible album, so that's worth checking out. One of the greatest jazz albums of the 1950s. Something else, Cannibal Adderley, Miles Davis, Hank Jones, Sam Jones, Art Blakey. So if you get fed up with people on these top tens quoting, you know, Giant Steps for Coltrane and Kind of Blue for Miles Davis, you want another album that really is them at their peak, and this is fiery as well. That's a great album. I've got Extensions by David Holland. This is a monumental album on ECM Records. It features David Holland, Steve Coleman, Kevin Eubanks and Marvin Spitty Smith. Steve Coleman here back in 1989. He's the architect of M-Bass, one of the most important musicians in the last 40 years in terms of jazz history. And I wanted to put Steve Coleman on this list, and I couldn't think of which M-Bass album to put on. But I think this is a sublime album. And every time I hold this one up on this channel, everyone chimes in and goes, yeah, one of the greatest albums of all time. British jazz saxophone players, Courtney Pine. This is like Coltrane crossed with A Tribe Called Quest. This is an incredible album, and Courtney Pine's virtuosity on here is off the scale. It's mind-blowing. And if you think it's some like cheesy jazz crossover, no, this is like listening to Coltrane but with a turntablist in the background. So there's that one there. And another super rare one, you know that middle of the road Muzak musician John Clement that does all the sessions, right? At some point, what year was it? According to this, it was 1987, but I've got a feeling it was earlier than that. He made this album, right, called Nexus One for Train. This is mind-blowing. And on here, we have Bob Magnuson on bass and Carl Burnett on drums. But Bob Magnuson is only on bass on two tracks. The rest of it is this sort of post-Coltrane interstellar space jazz of just drums and saxophone. If you're a saxophone player, check this out. It's incredible. So I've got to the end of the video. I'm on my new camera. I hope it's all worked out all right. I'm going to have to do some editing. I don't like doing editing. If you enjoyed this video, then, you know, like it and subscribe. If you want to see my next video, ring the notification bell. If you want to support me in what I'm doing, please join Patreon. And my patrons are getting now involved in making videos for me. So if you want to get involved in all that, then please, you know, get over to Patreon. There's a whole ton of stuff. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.